The debt-to-GDP ratio. When does it become dangerous? What if I told you a country could owe more than twice everything it produces in a year and still not collapse? And what if I also told you another country could drown with a much lower debt load? That is the strange, beautiful, slightly terrifying mystery of the debt-to-GDP ratio. Because most people hear one number and their brain immediately yells, over 100%? Game over. But sovereign debt is not your cousin's maxed-out credit card. It is not a payday loan wearing a national flag, and it is definitely not as simple as some economist on television pointing at a chart like he just discovered fire. Tonight, we go deep. We are going to answer one of the most important questions in economics. When does debt to GDP actually become dangerous? And here's the twist. There is no single number where a giant alarm goes off, a red light flashes, and the finance minister gets launched out of a cannon. No. Debt becomes dangerous when several conditions line up. High debt, weak growth, rising interest costs, fragile investor trust, bad debt structure, and a government that starts looking like it is juggling chainsaws on a trampoline. So buckle up, because this is not just a story about numbers. This is a story about power, trust, fear, growth, money printing, bond markets, and the moment a nation discovers that math has no sympathy. What is debt to GDP really? Let's make this simple. A country's debt-to-GDP ratio compares how much the government owes to how much the economy produces in a year. Think of GDP as national income generation capacity. Not exactly the government's income, but the economic engine from which taxes are ultimately pulled. So if a country has debt equal to 100% of GDP, that means the government owes roughly what the entire economy produces in 1 year. Now, at first glance, that sounds horrifying. If you owed 1 full year of your income, you might already be sweating. If you owed twice your income, you'd start Googling how to disappear respectfully. But countries are different. Why? Because governments usually roll debt over, issue long-term bonds, tax future income, and, if they control their own currency, sometimes finance themselves in ways households simply cannot. So debt to GDP is not a countdown clock to doom. It's more like a stress gauge. It tells us how heavy is the debt load relative to the economy's size. Useful? Absolutely. Perfect? Not even close. Because debt is not just about how much. It's also about who owes it, in what currency, at what interest rate, for how long, to whom, and whether the economy is growing faster than the debt burden. The first big plot twist. High debt does not always mean crisis. Here's where the rabbit hole opens. Japan has had an extraordinarily high debt ratio for years. According to the IMF data mapper, Japan's general government gross debt is about 226.8% of GDP. The United States is around 128.7%. Italy is around 138.3%. Nigeria, by contrast, is around 35%. Now pause. If debt alone were destiny, Japan should have exploded into a shower of government bond confetti a long time ago. But it didn't. Why? Because markets care more than the headline ratio. Japan has long benefited from deep domestic savings, strong institutional credibility, a large home investor base, borrowing in its own currency, and a channel bank with powerful backstop capacity. That doesn't make its debt harmless, but it changes the risk profile dramatically. Meanwhile, lower debt countries can still get into trouble if they borrow in foreign currency, face weak growth, collect too little tax revenue, or must refinance at punishing interest rates. So the number is not fake, it's just not the whole story. This is the part where the internet gets angry, because people love a single dramatic threshold. People want economics to work like a microwave. Press 90%, wait 3 minutes, nation explodes. Sorry, economics is messier, more like trying to cook soup during an earthquake.
So is there a magic danger line? Now we enter the forbidden temple of economics, the search for the number. For years, researchers and policymakers have debated if there's some debt-to-GDP level where growth slows sharply or crisis risk jumps. One widely cited BIS paper found that government debt above about 85% of GDP was associated with weaker growth outcomes in its sample. And instantly, many people treated 85% like it had been engraved on stone tablets and carried down a mountain by an exhausted economist. But the broader IMF view is more careful. There is no universal tipping point that applies to every country all the time. Debt sustainability depends on country-specific factors, including growth, interest rates, fiscal credibility, market access, exchange rate exposure, and rollover risk. So 90% can be manageable in one country and terrifying in another. 120% can be sustainable here and catastrophic there. 60% can be fine in one era and dangerous in another if interest rates spike and trust collapses. So no, there is no magic cliff. There is a danger zone, and the danger zone has multiple doors. The real formula: when debt turns from heavy to deadly. If you want the truth, here it is. Debt becomes dangerous when the government can't stabilize it without painful adjustment. In plainer English, when interest costs keep rising, growth is too weak, borrowing gets more expensive, and the government needs increasingly heroic budget discipline just to keep the debt ratio from snowballing. The IMF's debt sustainability framework centers on this problem: whether a country can meet its obligations and stabilize debt without a major correction that the market may no longer believe is feasible. Here's the hidden engine beneath the drama. If the interest rate on debt is higher than the growth rate of the economy, debt gets heavier more easily. If growth is stronger than interest costs, governments get breathing room. If they also run manageable primary deficits, or better yet, primary surpluses, they can stabilize debt even from a high starting point. This is the part nobody tells regular people. A country doesn't usually fail because someone on TV said, "Wow, 103%, that's a lot." A country gets into danger because the dynamics turn against it. Not just the level, the motion. Not the photograph, the movie. And in the movie, the villains are rising refinancing costs, short maturities, foreign currency debt, stagnant growth, political paralysis, and markets suddenly deciding, "You know what? I liked you better yesterday." So the 5 warning signs. Let me give your audience the clean framework. 1. Interest payments start eating the budget. This is a huge one. The OECD reports that interest payment burdens in its member countries have risen, with interest payments to GDP ratio averaging 3.3% in 2024 and remaining elevated as refinancing continues at higher rates. That means more tax money goes to old borrowing instead of roads, defense, wages, hospitals, or tax relief. In other words, the government starts working a second job just to pay interest. That's not a healthy household, that's not a healthy business, and it's not a healthy state. 2. Debt must be refinanced too often. If a country relies on short-term borrowing, it has to keep returning to the market, again and again and again. That's fine when investors are calm, but when panic arrives, short maturities are like building your house out of dry leaves and then arguing with the weather. The OECD notes that a large share of fixed-rate debt in OECD countries matures in the near term, meaning refinancing at higher rates can worsen debt service pressure. 3. Debt is in foreign currency. Now things get nasty. If a government borrows in a currency it can't print, say dollars instead of its own money, then currency depreciation can make the debt burden explode. Now the country is not just fighting debt, it's fighting exchange rates too. That's like owing rent to a landlord who keeps moving the building farther away. The World Bank warns about the sovereign bank nexus, the deadly embrace, where weak governments hurt banks and weak banks hurt governments. In a sample it highlighted, 16 of 33 EMDEEs with high bank exposure to government debt also faced high government debt risks. So the debt problem jumps from government issue to whole financial system issue. And that's when the music changes. 4. Growth slows while deficits remain high. This is the silent killer. A country can survive high debt for a long time if growth is decent, but if growth stalls and deficits continue, debt stops being a burden and starts becoming a trap. That's when the snowball starts rolling downhill, except the snowball is made of bond yields and cabinet meetings. Why some countries get away with it? Now let's answer the question everyone asks. How can one country have massive debt and still look fine? Because sovereign debt is built on trust architecture. Countries that tend to carry higher debt more safely usually have some mix of credible institutions, deep local capital markets, borrowing in their own currency, longer maturities, stable tax systems, stronger central bank credibility, and investors who believe the state will keep functioning tomorrow. That last part matters more than people realize. Debt is a number, but borrowing is a relationship, and relationships run on confidence. If bond investors believe this country is messy but solvent, they lend. If they believe this country is improvising fiscal policy like a man trying to fix a jet engine with a spoon, they demand higher yields. And once yields rise, the debt math worsens. And once the math worsens, confidence falls further. And once confidence falls further, welcome to the feedback loop. The moment it becomes dangerous. So when does debt to GDP become dangerous? Here is the answer your title promises. It becomes dangerous when investors, taxpayers, and policymakers can all feel that the debt burden is no longer being carried by growth and credibility, but by hope. More technically, it becomes dangerous when debt dynamics stop being stabilizable under realistic assumptions, when the required primary balance becomes politically or economically implausible, when refinancing risk rises, when interest costs crowd out public priorities, when the currency is vulnerable, when banks and sovereigns are tied together, when markets begin to doubt repayment without inflation, restructuring, or outside support. That is the danger zone. Not one number, a condition, a climate, a smell in the air. The debt ratio is the smoke. The real danger is whether there is already fire in the walls. The global picture right now. And this story matters right now because the world is not exactly moving toward less debt. The OECD said in March 2026 that outstanding debt in OECD countries rose from $55 trillion in 2024 to $61 trillion in 2025, with debt relative to GDP stable at 83% in 2025, but projected to rise to 85% in 2026. It also projects record sovereign bond issuance in OECD countries of $18 trillion in 2026. Meanwhile, IMF data show the world's general government gross debt around 96.8% of GDP on the IMF Data Mapper profile for the world. So this is not an academic conversation. This is not economists playing Sudoku in a basement. This is the operating environment of the modern world. Governments need to spend on aging populations, defense, climate adaptation, energy systems, and growth. But higher rates mean debt is no longer cheap background music. It is back in the foreground, kicking the door open. Now let's crush the myth. The myth is, once debt passes 100% of GDP, collapse is inevitable. That is false. The truth is harsher and more interesting. A country can survive above 100% for a long time. A country can also get into trouble far below 100%. because sustainability is not about a number alone. It is about whether the system can keep financing itself without panic, inflationary escape, default, or crushing austerity. That is why headlines mislead people. The headline says, debt hits 110%. The deeper question is, at what rate? Held by whom? In what currency? With what maturity? Against what growth path? With what tax capacity? Under what political credibility? That's where the real story lives. And unfortunately for lazy commentators, that story requires more than one scary number and a dramatic thumbnail. Though, to be fair, we're absolutely using a dramatic thumbnail. The human lesson. At this point, your audience should feel the deeper lesson. Debt is not just borrowing from the future. It's making a bet on the future. A bet that growth will come. A bet that politics will stay functional. A bet that interest rates will remain tolerable. A bet that markets will keep believing. A bet that tomorrow's taxpayers will carry what today's leaders approve. And when those bets are sensible, debt can fund development, stabilize recessions, build infrastructure, and prevent collapse. But when those bets stack too high, debt stops being a tool and becomes a master. That's when nations discover a brutal truth. You do not always go broke the day you borrow too much. Sometimes you go broke the day the market decides it no longer wants to pretend with you. So, when does the debt-to-GDP ratio become dangerous? Not at one fixed number, not at 60%, not automatically at 90%, not magically at 100%. It becomes dangerous when the debt burden outruns growth, interest costs rise, refinancing gets harder, trust weakens, and the state can no longer stabilize the path without pain the system may not survive, politically or financially. That's the real answer. And that answer is both less satisfying and far more dangerous, because it means the line isn't painted on the road, it moves. And by the time everyone agrees the debt is dangerous, the country is already standing in the middle of it. If this changed the way you see national debt, comment, "It's the dynamics." And for the next video, we can go even deeper. Who actually owns government debt, and what happens if they stop buying?